we'd have to take a look at it. But, Mr. Speaker, if I could, I think we should look at the document upon which this is founded, the roadmap that the Conservatives are following with respect to the correctional system and with their agenda as it comes to prisons overall. Both Jackson and Mr. Jackson and Mr. Stewart reviewed this particular document, this roadmap, in a report entitled A Flawed Compass, a human rights analysis of the roadmap to strengthening public safety. In this document, they stated they had three very specific areas that I'm going to read from. They called them 3 strikes. They started with the fact, and I quote from the report, it tramples on human rights and human dignity, strike 1. It will threaten public safety by making conditions in prisons more dangerous and undermine the pathways to prisoner retention, strike 2. It will place enormous financial burdens on taxpayers in lengthening and deepening the state of imprisonment, the disastrous path the U.S. has traveled, strike 3. It goes on to say, unless there be any doubt about the abject failure as an exercise in principled and effective corrections, there is a 4th strike. It will intensify what the Supreme Court has characterized already as staggering injustice of the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in prisons in Canada. In his portion of the address, Stewart noted a 5th strike against the so-called roadmap, quote, the near total absence of evidence to support its conclusions and recommendations. And so we need to consider this carefully, not only because this plan is ineffective, because it's been tried in other jurisdictions and failed so miserably, but because the costs are so staggering that they have already buried other jurisdictions that have attempted this. This government is chasing after California when California itself is running away from the disaster it created. We know in California that they adopted a very similar strategy with respect to corrections, building ever larger prisons, upping the number of people who and time that's spent in them. The result was not safer communities. It was staggering debt, unbelievable costs, and in fact, less safe communities. In California, rates of recidivism, the rate at which people reoffend, has now crossed to 70%. That means 7 out of 10 people who will walk out of an institution, a prison, will recommit a crime, will recidivate. It's not exactly an example we want to follow, particularly when California is left in a situation where prisons, like a vacuum, have sucked money out of health care, have sucked money out of education, out of infrastructure, out of priorities that Californians otherwise would want to see their government invest in. And so we're barreling down this path, and what's particularly concerning with all the bills that we have in front of us, not just this bill but others, is there's not even a bother to offer a costing of what this direction is going to be. In fact, the Public Safety Minister has said he knows the cost but won't tell. What we do know in just one bill is that while the Public Safety Minister, the former Public Safety Minister, told the House that a bill was going to cost $90 million, when I had requested Mr. Kevin Page, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, to do a review, and he agreed to do that review, as soon as there was the threat of review, that number changed from $90 million to the Minister saying, well, whoops, I made a mistake, it's $2 billion. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, when he concluded his report, didn't say it was $2 billion. It was going to be $10 to $13 billion in costs over the same period of time. They were talking about $90 million. This is an egregious amount of money, but it's only one bill. And when you consider the fact that Canada right now is suffering under the largest deficit in its history, where the country is going to have to make tough choices about how to undo the fiscal mismanagement that we've seen over the last number of years, one has to ask how we can possibly afford tens of billions of dollars in constructing new prisons. And the problem with this strategy is at the same time that they're building all of these prisons and ratcheting up all these costs, they're slashing from the very things that stop crime from happening in the first place. So, as an example, the Victims of Crime Initiative has been cut by more than 70%. The Victims of Crime Initiative has been cut by 41%. So the very things that develop community capacity, that allow at a community level for organizations to break cycles of violence and addiction and the things that drive crime, are being cut. And when I go across the country and I talk to communities, and whether or not it's boys and girls clubs or church organizations or not-for-profit groups, and they talk about how that cut in funding has impacted their ability to make a difference in their communities, when they talk about the fact that they have no doubt in their minds that that will lead to more crime, less safety, I think that we need to reflect on that. Dr. Irving Waller, who's a leading thinker in this country about how we should approach preventing crime and how keeping our communities safe, has, I think, quite clearly proven that for every dollar we invest in prevention, we save 11 in other costs, whether or not it's incarceration or it's probation or parole or all these other things that are related. So you can imagine if you're cutting from the thing that saves money at a ratio of $11 for every dollar you spend, and at the same time you're ratcheting up your prison spending, it's a disaster in terms of its fiscal impact. It's going to blow a crater into the budget, the likes of which is going to be almost impossible to repair. So we're at a critical juncture where we have to make a choice about what path, what roadmap, if you want to use conservative language, we choose and how we deal moving forward. I would suggest that beyond reinvesting that money in crime prevention and going back to those communities, that we should go one step further. In communities like Kitchener-Waterloo or Summerside PEI, I was able to go and visit crime prevention councils who developed for their communities an action plan to enhance their safety in their communities, driven from the ground up, saying exactly what they needed to make their communities safe places. Not some federal dictate that comes down or some federal program that they have to twist and contort themselves to fit into, but a locally driven community action plan that the federal government gets behind and supports. A plan that recognizes the importance of breaking cycles of violence, that recognizes that for our inmates, more than 80% of them are facing addiction issues, and that for most crime that is being faced in communities, it stems back to problems with substance abuse. Programs that recognize that victims of crime often later become perpetrators of crime in a cycle of victimization that must be broken at a community level. They recognize as well that having additional police on the ground, having proactive policing, going out and working and engaging young people in a positive, meaningful way, giving them positive outlets to express themselves. These are all ways of making our communities actually safer, not just using words or trying to play politics with crime. But it doesn't end there. I think we also have to look at what we do in the prisons. At a point at which a young person first has their interaction with the law and makes a mistake, what is the course of action we're going to take? Right now, too many young people, when they're first committing a crime, are stuck in remand, where they're not able to get access to any programs or services to make them better. I don't disagree with the elimination as an example of the 2-for-1 remand credit, but let's understand why the remand credits existed. It's because the conditions in remand were so reprehensible, and because young people were going into conditions as minor criminals and spending time with major criminals and coming out ready to commit major offenses. In essence, we were creating crime factories. And so if we're interested in breaking these cycles, we need to do what so many parents who've faced the struggle of having a young person who's heading down a dark path have, where they've said to me, if I had a place where I could take my son or daughter, where I could put them at the door and know they would get better, know that by bringing them there they would become better, that they were able to break that addiction, I would walk them to the door myself. But they know prison isn't that place. They know, in fact, that when they go to prison, their addiction issues get worse, not better. And in fact, we're facing not only addiction issues, but when they get there, often extremely high rates of infectious disease. And I've had some people say to me, well, who cares if, the HIV rate is 4 times or 5 times the rate of the general population, or the hepatitis rate is many more times higher in prison than the general population. Folks, we have to remember that more than 90% of people who walk in a prison door will walk back out. Their health, their rehabilitation is not some criminal-hugging interest. It's a self-interest. It's an interest of every Canadian because it has a direct and deep impact on the community's safety. on public health. So we need to have places where people actually go to get better. And what's disturbing about this path that the Conservatives are choosing to walk down is at the same time that they're cutting from prevention and they're cutting from support for victims, in the prisons themselves they're cutting programs. Mr. Speaker, I had an opportunity to visit every prison farm in the country. I talked with correctional officers who've worked in these facilities, in some cases for longer than 30 years. To a last one, every single one told me it was the best program that we had in corrections. I met with inmates who went through the prison farm program, looked them in their eyes as they talked about the transformation that it caused within them, how working with animals bred empathy and compassion, about how the program placed at their end of their sentence got them ready to reintegrate. Not because agriculture into itself is the solution, although unlike the government, I do believe agriculture is still relevant. Believe it or not, the public safety minister said agriculture is essentially a dead end and there was no purpose to teaching it to people. But it misses a fundamental point, that for these men who are going through the program, who are spending 10 hours a day working on a farm, who, because it's a voluntary program, had to wake up on their own will at 5 or 6 in the morning and go in and put in a full day's work, working with animals, understanding empathy, understanding the value of work, that the dignity of that work, the structure of that work, is fundamentally what changed them. And that when they came out, when I talked to employers in the construction industry or elsewhere, were told that they were some of the best inmates they could hope to hire when they came out, because they understood that value of work. So while it's true that not every one of them was hired in agriculture, in fact the vast majority weren't, they were hired and they were engaged in meaningful ways. And what correctional officer after correctional officer told me is there wasn't a single rate of recidivism. This program's cut, gone, dead. Its cost, $4 million a year. Now, $4 million is a lot of money. It's 2 fake lakes. But it's not a lot of money relative to the cost benefit that this provides. And I think it's deeply shameful that at the same time you're ballooning prison populations, you're cutting some of the most effective programs at making people better. So you're cutting prevention, you're cutting from victims, and now you're cutting from programs inside of prison. And the argument is, this is going to make us safer. And when I dare to speak out against this agenda, what do we get day in, day out in question period, but members standing up and talking about how I'm a criminal hugger, about how I don't care about public safety, about how somehow I care less about the safety of my children than they do theirs. Now, I believe Conservatives are misguided on these issues. I believe they're taking us down a wrong and perilous path that has proven in every jurisdiction it has been tried to fail. But I would not subscribe to one of them, a motive that didn't care about community safety, and they shouldn't impart it upon any other member. It does a disservice to this chamber. We also have to recognize, Mr. Speaker, and I know my time is limited, but the impact of mental health and the importance of dealing with mental health in our prisons, particularly in female institutions, where serious, and I'm talking about very serious mental health issues, will often make up more than 25% of a prison's population. In the male population, the number's lower, but still startlingly high. And what I hear from police chiefs across the country is more often than not, we're using our prisons as repositories for people with mental illness. We're taking those who are suffering from mental conditions, who have no support and no way of getting off the streets, and waiting for them to commit crimes so police can do something with them. Then they're transferred into prisons, where prisons are woefully underprepared to deal with their mental illness. As a result, they often put them into segregation. And in these segregation cells, their conditions further deteriorate. We're all aware of the story of Ashley Smith. Ashley was a 17-year-old girl whose crime was to throw an apple at a postman and to steal a CD. Ashley had mental challenges, and when she was put into prison, they got much worse. A prison system didn't know how to deal with her, had her in a segregated cell for 11 solid months. And as Ashley tried to kill herself and kill herself and kill herself, there was no interjection until finally Ashley self-asphyxiated and died. Mr. Speaker, we need to do much better than this. we can't allow mentally ill to languish in prisons with no hope of getting better. Or for people like when I was in Her Majesty's Penitentiary in St. John's, to be locked into a facility where they had no hope of getting out and getting better. There does need to be a roadmap, but it's not this one. We can do a lot better. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question.